earlier, we were sort of looking at, we were looking briefly at some of the NRV methods. So I had this long list here, and we're looking at some of the applications, some examples, some of the limitations in a very sort of broad-based way. We're going to get into a little more details now under each of the methods. One of the things that I'd like to say before we actually move on is that each of these valuation methods, they can be grouped into about 3 categories. So direct market prices, or market prices, as you see there, as a valuation method, that's in its own category by itself, it's unique. But then you have some others that we put in a category called revealed preference, where preferences are sort of revealed in the marketplace, are revealed in what we refer to as sort of like surrogate markets. So examples of revealed preference would be replacement costs, damage costs avoided, net factor income, production function, hedonic pricing, because the method, the price or the value is revealed based on an approach or application, all right? So for example, when we go into replacement costs, the price of the ecosystem is revealed based on the value of the man-made replacement that is used for the service. So that's the notion of revealed preference. There are some methods like contingent valuation, choice modeling, co-joint analysis, etc., which are other types of NRVs. And I think these may be the ones that persons are most familiar with. They are referred to as stated preference techniques, where, for example, they use surveys. It's a lot more complex than the revealed preference techniques, where you ask people to state their preferences for some hypothetical change in the ecosystem and what they are willing to pay either through taxes or some other form to either preserve this space or to rehabilitate this particular space so that they can get the flow of ecosystem services. So I just wanted to add that. So the first, of course, please, are you all seeing my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Please stop me if you need to. So the first method is one that we refer to as market pricing. And as I said before, really it's very straightforward. It is used to value those particularly goods which can be bought and sold in a competitive market space. Now, there are some limitations to that, in that oftentimes you may not get the true value of that aspect of the ecosystem, if there is distortions in the marketplace. So think about if there was a subsidy on, say, fishing equipment, would we be getting the real value of the components of the coral reef related to fishing? We will get it would undervalue the reef, because the value of the price of the fish, etc., would be lower than it would normally have been if those subsidies did not exist. So in market pricing, you also have to be careful, because there can be distortions in the marketplace. So it's useful, as we said before, for valuing environmental goods that are directly traded in markets. Of course, as a method, it is straightforward, it's very easy to apply, and it only really uses simple modeling, a few assumptions to determine the price. It's also an inexpensive method to use. The fact is, market pricing is very limited in its use as an NRV instrument, simply because when you think about it, when you look at the total economic values that you did for each of the 3 ecosystems, what you would realize is that the value of the ecosystems, much of what came out in that TOV cannot be traded directly in the marketplace, right? So you can't really find prices for them. So it is one of the, it's a sort of weaker technique because market pricing has been traditionally used to determine the value of ecosystem services because it's simple. Oh, well, the value of this particular ecosystem is the fish or the surface water, but it goes much deeper than that. So this is just on the screen before you. This is just some information about how you actually go about undertaking a market pricing. And as you would see, it is relatively simple because basically what you're doing is determining the sources of the data is really, you can get it if you're looking at the value of the reef from the perspective of the fish, you're going to be looking at government statistics, you're going to be looking at their number of fish landings for that particular site, the price of fish, etc. And of course, it would be important to identify if the price is distorted, multiply the price by the change in quantity to determine. So if, for example, you're going to make a change in the ecosystem, or you're going to be impacting the ecosystem, what becomes the change? What is the value of the change that can happen? So it's a very simple, straightforward, it's simple math, making a few assumptions and putting in place mechanisms to address distortion in price. The second method we're going to look at, and these to me are the more interesting ones and the ones that are normally least used. They have become more and more popular over the years, but in the past they were the least used form of valuation. And if you looked back at the TEV that you did, you can see several applications in which replacement costs can be applied. And simply as it says, it estimates the value of the ecosystem service simply as a cost for replacing that service with a man-made alternative, good or service. A really good example is the example of wetlands, right? Because your wetlands, they act as a natural reservoir. And what you're saying is that if you destroy that wetland or you fill up that wetland for, say, development, you can estimate the cost. The value of the wetland would be based on the cost of constructing and operating an artificial reservoir of a similar capacity. Everybody sort of clear on that?
Liz, there's a sentence at the end of the slide. I was just wondering, it looks unfinished. It does not require the use of detailed something.
Analyses, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Because it's simple, right? We're saying, okay, this is what we're going to lose. This is what we're going to replace it with. What could you see as a disadvantage in this method when you think about an ecosystem? So let's say we're going to construct a 1,000 room hotel, and we're going to be using aspects of the wetland to do that. And we're saying, well, we can fix this by putting in some sort of artificial wastewater processing facility. What can we lose? What are some of the things that we may not factor in?
So you mean you're only accounting for one function of that wetland in that way?
Correct.
Exactly. Because when you think of, and that's the beauty of the TEV, because you're saying, okay, we're going to replace this. But what about, it makes you begin to think about, what about these other things? How are we going to get those services? Or do we need those services? You understand?
Yes.
But sometimes when you're thinking about this, think about even presenting this. Okay, before I go into my point, I'll hear Kimar. Kimar, go ahead. Your hand is raised.
Yeah, that factor you mentioned a while ago, is it a particular issue with this replacement cost we're looking at, or is it that in using this method, we should be able to look at more than one factor associated with the particular ecosystem?
Okay,
So for
so go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, so for instance, we're saying that we're only looking at the reservoir aspect or the drainage function of it then. But using the replacement method, can't we consider all functions or benefits of the ecosystem and then factor it into the cost that we are trying to derive?
Okay, so that's the TV, but what we're saying that there are different methods of valuing different aspects or components of the TV. So replacement costs can be used, for example, to replacement costs is applicable where you can replace the ecosystem service with a man-made alternative. You would agree that not every aspect of the services that an ecosystem provides can be replaced with a man-made alternative. We agree on that? Is there agreement on that?
Agreed.
Yes,
Right.
agreed.
So this particular method looks at which aspect of the ecosystem can we replace with something that is man-made that we can construct and operate. Okay, so we can determine the value of that service based on the cost of replacing it with a man equivalent. But what I'm also saying is that we have to be careful that when we say that the ecosystem is worth X because we're replacing this function of wastewater processing that we would normally have gotten from a wetland, we cannot really say that the value of the wetland is simply the cost of this particular replacement, because we have to remember that the wetland provides several other services. We can, however, state that this is the main service, for example, and that the other services that would be lost are not as significant or can be found elsewhere. They're not going to have as detrimental an impact, right? But the idea behind all of this is to know what the costs are for each of the services. And if you get rid of that, ecosystem or that service, the idea is, where are you going to get that service from? Can it be replaced? Can it not be replaced? Can society do without it? Right? So as we push for ecosystem-based adaptation and using ecosystems as a climate change adaptation strategy, it stands to reason that we understand what services the ecosystem provides, the state of ecosystems that we have, the value of an intact ecosystem, not saying that we can't have development, but the value of having those services in existence, and how society will be impacted if those services don't exist within the face of a changing climate. And I think that's what we want to get to. So we're not just valuing the ecosystem for the sake of knowing the monetary value of the ecosystem. We're looking at it within the construct that we have these ecosystems that are degraded. That's one. Can we begin to look at, conservation, look at rehabilitation of ecosystems, because the lost services that these ecosystems, or the services that have been lost, are at a cost to society. And with climate change, it's going to add up. It's going to be greater, higher costs. All right. And in development now, in looking forward, can we afford to simply just replace a particular ecosystem service with a man-made service? And is that enough? Can we lose the rest of services? And these are the kinds of questions that you want to put forth to your policymakers with evidence. I'm seeing someone in the chat. Okay, and importantly as well, thanks for this, Aisha. And I'll let you elaborate if you would like, but it is important for us to understand as well that you may have initial installation and construction, but what about the maintenance costs throughout the life cycle of the man-made replacement? And many times when these valuations are being done, the maintenance costs throughout the life cycle of the man-made device is not factored in. Aisha, you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it, because I mean, we're now looking at sustainability of a ecosystem versus a man-made product.
Okay. So basically what we're saying is that the replacement cost technique is really saying, or it assumes that the costs incurred in replacing the environmental asset with this man-made alternative is really the estimate of the value of the service received from the asset. And let me qualify, it's the value of one service received from the asset. It is obviously, we can see where it is a useful method for valuing an aspect of an ecosystem service that has a direct man-made or artificial equivalent. So we could quickly think of things like water storage or water processing. Can you think of any other ecosystem services that have direct man-made replacements? Are there any other things that you can think about? Think back to the TVs.
Coastal protection.
Right. Elaborate so that for those who may not be sure what you're talking about.
Breakwaters, groins, hard structure.
Okay, right. Coastal protection. And this is replacing what? What ecosystem service is it replacing?
Well, it will replace multiple seagrass beds, coral reefs, and mangroves.
And how effective?
Well, that depends. I mean, the one function, right? And it depends on what that's designed. If it's a 50 or 100-year, whatever the storm event that they're designed to handle.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Any other? Like each of these techniques, they're based on one or two services of the ecosystem and not all services. So to be clear, we're not using the method to provide a total correct measure of the value of the ecosystem. Now, one of the negatives of replacement costs, so one of the, I want to say maybe a disadvantage or the weaknesses, is that you often cannot find an exact man-made alternative with the equivalent level of benefits, right? So you encounter another problem there, because if you're looking at a man-made piece of infrastructure that provides a lower level of service, then the value of the ecosystem would be underestimated, right? It's a very straightforward calculation as well, because you're really looking at the service provided, you're looking at identifying the man-made good or service or infrastructure to replace the ecosystem, and then you're estimating the cost based on that, taking into account maintenance costs and the life cycle of the particular infrastructure that you put in. Any comments or questions there?
I have a question in relation. I don't know how the scale difference may, or how the scale may differ, but for example, in an agricultural environment, if there would be like the replacement of the natural vegetation to say create stone walls or something like that? Does this apply to that replacement cost situation?
You elaborate on that a little more.
So
What are you taking away and what are you?
the natural vegetation being providing the function of slope stability, but removing that to put in the actual like reinforcement, the stone walls or whatever to reinforce the slope. So removing the service provided by the vegetation to replace it with a similar function, but using the stone walls instead. I'm asking if it's similar to what was being discussed about the replacement cost.
But what are you replacing? And why? Just asking. Is this just a structure that will help to create slope stability? Did you do something to impact slope stability?
So it would be all right. So what I'm understanding is replacing the vegetation is providing a similar function in relation to slope stability, but instead of relying on the vegetation, there would be, I guess, the inclination towards the physical stone structure as being a better provider of that service, the slope stability. So in that case, would there potentially then be a need for the valuation of what the existing vegetation provides or so on? Or is it that I'm not understanding this whole concept of replacement cost?
I'm not understanding what you're asking me, but I can redo replacement costs. So replacement costs, what we're looking at is if we're going to be utilizing or removing an ecosystem service, the value of the what we're trying to find is the value of the service, the monetary value of a service, right? And if we were to replace that service, what would we lose? So that's simply what it is. So you have a service, it's flood prevention, right? So this is a service that your wetlands provide. If you're going to be using your wetland to the point where the wetland cannot perform the function, can you replace the function with something that is man-made? And that's the notion of replacement cost. Replacing an ecosystem function with a man-made alternative.
Okay, thank you.
So you're looking at an ecosystem, you're saying the value of the ecosystem provides this particular service. If we don't have this service anymore, can we replace it with something that is man-made? The cost of the man-made infrastructure is a proxy for the cost of the service that the ecosystem would have provided. Understand?
Yeah, to some extent, but I'm definitely going to revise it further. So I can better understand if even the example.
Yeah, I'm not getting your thing about the slope stability. Is it that, why are you replacing the vegetation?
The replacement would be because of just the belief that physical structure would provide a better service.
And what are you valuing? What do you want to determine the value of? What are you trying to determine the value of?
The removal of the vegetation.
No, that's not what the value is. You're determining the value of an ecosystem service. What is the value? What service does that particular ecosystem provide?
The slope stability.
It provides slope stability, right? And what you're saying, you want to remove the vegetation and remove the slope stability. or you're saying that you need, because it may not be valuation and natural resource valuation you're looking at. You're maybe saying that this particular slope needs to be better stabilized because the vegetation is not providing that function. So your research would then have to do, is there something else, other types of vegetation that we can use as a natural solution to make that slope more stable? Has the stability of the slope been affected by, you know, a change in the original vegetation that was there? So what is there now isn't enabling it to carry out its function. So you understand, it's almost like a different level of analysis.
Okay, right. Thanks.
So it may not be NRV that you're looking at. If you know what
Right.
So I think the question kind of is like, if there's a degraded system, do you apply the same type of valuation method to it?
Well, if you have a degraded system, you're still looking at the ecosystem in its true sense, right? So degraded or not, when you did your TEV this morning, did you think of the system as degraded or not degraded? When you did the total economic value in your groups, you just did a total economic value, right?
But I think there's
Yes.
one line assumption that it's a healthy one, like a good one.
No, there is no assumption. If
Okay.
it is a watershed, what is a watershed supposed to do? Forget if it's degraded or not degraded. What is a watershed supposed to do? It's supposed to do ABC, XYZ. What is a coral reef supposed to do? It's supposed to do ABC, XYZ. All right. Then what you do now is that you want to value the service that it provides. So currently in this degraded system, we're saying that the value that the coral reef provides is that it could provide, and this is where damage cost avoided comes in actually, is $100. How do we know this? Because the damage to property and infrastructure based on the passage of a hurricane or a storm was $100. So we're using the damage as the proxy to value the ecosystem. You understand? So we could look back and say, based on the costs, I think in the first class, we looked at the impact of some storms on GDP. Based on the impact of those storms and the amount of money it costs the country, we could safely say that the value of our coral reefs are the cost that we incurred as a result of the storm surge damage. So the question now becomes, should we, if we're using coral reefs as a form of EBA, should we use coral reefs as a form of EBA to protect our population by investing in coral reef rehabilitation, or ensuring that our coral reefs do not become further degraded? Because with the increase in intensity and frequency of storms, that impact that we saw from TC Nicole may be 3 times as much in a given year because of the frequency and intensity. Sort of clear? So you're looking at the ecosystem as it is. This is the total economic value. How do I find the value of this? If I made a change positively or negatively in the ecosystem, what would the new value be? All right. And how do I determine that new value? Hearing a lot of silence. All right, so let's go on to damage cost avoided and just describe what it is. Okay, one of the things we know is that our ecosystems, as it says up here, provide protection for other economically valuable assets. What the damage cost avoided does, it takes the value, it either uses the value of property and assets protected by the ecosystem, or the cost of actions taken to avoid the damage. So you can actually look at the damage to the system. You can actually look at the damage to a system, and then the cost of that damage really gives you a proxy for the value of the service that your coral reef could have provided if it was properly functioning, right? So it's particularly useful for valuing ecosystems that provide forms of natural protection. The thing about it is, how can we be assured, how can we say the value of storm protection from a coral reef is $1 million because it caused $1 million worth of damage before? Are we implying, for example, that another storm of a similar magnitude will cause the same amount of damage? So it is not necessarily always a very accurate measure of the value of that particular ecosystem. And of course, one of the things I think that you all are trying to get at is the whole notion of ecosystem status. If there are changes in ecosystems, do the value of the ecosystems change? So if there are positive changes, it means that the value of the ecosystem and the service that it's providing would actually increase. If it's degraded, if the ecosystem is degraded, it cannot provide its function, the value of the ecosystem may be understated because of that, because of the flow of goods and services, right, that it provides. This is also a sort of straightforward method as well in terms of damage cost avoided, how the different steps that you use to identify, to really identify the value of the system. I mean, it sounds simple, but it does have some technical calculations behind it. And of course, this particular damage cost avoided would rely on a lot of data. It will also rely on a lot of historical data, sometimes some of which we do not collect or do not have. So things like your dollar and so on becomes very important. But then in the past, I do not think, I mean, Nadine, you're good with the dollar, that we were incorporating environmental losses and the cost of the losses to the environment in the damage and loss assessment. I think that's now a very recent phenomenon. Any questions or comments there?
Yes, one for clarity. The
Please,
damage cost avoided is how much it would cost to replace the property, but the replacement cost would be how much it would cost to replace the ecosystem.
The damage cost avoided gives you a value of the ecosystem service based on the actual damage to the infrastructure. So you're saying based on this damage to this particular piece of infrastructure, we could estimate that our coral reef is actually valued that, right? But because it was not able to carry out its function, it costs this amount of damage. So if we were to invest in whatever systems to make our coral reefs better, we would avoid this kind of damage in the future.
Okay.
Whereas
thank
the
you.
replacement cost is saying we're utilizing a component of this ecosystem, and if we want to maintain the services or we want to have better services from this particular ecosystem, this is what we can do. We can replace it with some man-made thing, an equivalent man-made piece of infrastructure that could carry out the function. So in other words, you're saying we're replacing the natural ecosystem with a man-made function. Of course, there are negatives to that, in that that particular man-made, that particular piece of infrastructure may not be able to carry out all the functions that we actually envisage, or the ecosystem should actually be able to do. All right. I think we're on to net income factor. which is the value of an ecosystem service as an input in the production of a marketed good. This is particularly useful, has been used to value ecosystem services, particularly in the tourism sector. So it's useful in tourism and fisheries, where we mentioned earlier, so that if you have a coral reef, for example, on our coral reefs, we do a lot of diving, reef diving, recreation, etc. The value of that particular service that is provided by the coral reef could be calculated as the revenue that we receive on an annual basis from selling, for example, diving trips, minus the cost of the gear, minus the cost of the human resources used to, like the tour operators, etc. that would, you know, they're the ones who you buy the trip from. So whatever the value they get, plus the value of the actual gear and the equipment and the cost of, so the value of it is everything except those other costs. And you determine the value on a yearly basis based on the amount of visits, the amount of times people pay to do snorkeling, etc. So it really looks at the ecosystem within the context of the value of its support, or the value of the ecosystem and the support it provides to things like tourism, fisheries, etc. So again, instead of using market prices for fisheries, you can look at fisheries from the construct of a coral reef. How much fish landings from this particular coral reef per year, how much livelihoods does it support? And that gives you a sense of the value of the reef based on the contribution the reef makes to a livelihood or to the production of fish. Is that one simple? So if we know that in our economy, the market price in the fishery sector is distorted because there are multiple subsidies on fishing lines and nets and boats, etc., we could actually determine the value of the contribution of the coral reef to fisheries by utilizing this net income factor. So net meaning we're taking out certain things from the price. Similar to the subsidies, we're taking out anything that would distort the value of the reef. So make it more or make it less. We're just taking those off. Is that one simple? Anybody? Not hearing anybody.
Could you just go back to the slide before again, please?
Which one? This one?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can I, before
the
you put your question together, I'm going to ask you to think about something, not you. Then I'll come back to you. I'm not seeing whose hand it is though. Who am I? Oh, Kamar. Okay, I'm going to ask, how many people have ever done any NRV before? Just by a show of hands, but Kamar, you go ahead.
Okay, so in using this method to calculate the value of the coral reefs, right? As in the second paragraph you have here. I'm thinking with the impact of COVID had on the tourism sector, right? Wouldn't using this method, for instance, in that time period, give a lesser value of the coral reef, given that there wouldn't be as much revenues coming in from the diving activities?
But COVID would be like I mean, it's a shock, right? So it would give a distorted figure. So you wouldn't use a COVID year. You would have to sort of minus up the years of COVID, because that was an anomaly, because the entire sector was shut down. So you wouldn't use that to put a value. That's almost like saying it's the same sort of concept of a subsidy. If we put subsidies on the inputs to fishing, so we give a subsidy for fish bait and we give a subsidy for what you give subsidies for? Lines and nets and boats and so on. If we gave subsidies for all of that, wouldn't the price of the fish that we buy in the market be lower? Would it be? Because everything in production is lower, right? Correct? When you put a subsidy on something, is it cheaper?
Yes, reduce cost.
It usually is, right? I mean, it's sometimes one of the bad things about subsidies. I mean, we're not, it's not an econ class, but a subsidy is not a good thing because many times the person who is to benefit from the subsidy doesn't, because there is usually a midman in between the subsidy and the beneficiary, which is like the person who is selling the good. They often do not pass on the savings to the consumer, right? So it's a very distorted thing. But if you think about a COVID year, almost like the same way you think about a subsidy, it would present a distortion in the price. So for years like 2020 and 2021, I mean, there are certain things that we couldn't do it for those years because, I mean, yes, your sector was shut down. So you couldn't do a valuation and say, well, okay, well, the value is, you couldn't use the figures for 2019, for 2020 or 2021, because the figures would be significantly lower than years before without a loss of the ecosystem, agreed? Because it's not like we had a major hurricane that we lost the ecosystem so that there could be no tourism or, you get what I'm saying? It was an anomaly year, so you can't use that as a calculate in your calculation to determine the value over time. You would have to actually discount for that if you were to look at the streams of benefits from your coral reefs for the last 30 years. In other words, you'd have to put a notation as to why you would have deleted 2020 and 2021 from that analysis, because it would give a distorted figure. So if you think of it very simply in mathematical terms, if you did 10 exams and on each of your exams you got, on 2 of those exams you were absent because you had COVID, would it be fair for your average to be out of 10?
No, out of 8.
Exactly. So in the same way, you couldn't use a COVID year to say that's the value of the reef because there was no activity in that year. But in the case of a hurricane now, you could say why did things changed? Why did the flow coming out of the reef, because it got damaged, the value of the reef itself dropped, or the value of the streams of benefits coming from the reef dropped because there was a change in the ecosystem itself. In the case of COVID, there was no change in the ecosystem to cause a change in value of the reef. There was a change in variables outside of the ecosystem affecting. You understand what I'm saying now?
Yep.
Everybody sort of clear on that?
Yeah, understood.
Can I get the show of hands? Because as I said this morning, what we're doing is a crash course. This course can happen over 5 weeks, like the EbA course, because it's sort of very detailed. So Rose did some, Howard, Aisha, you did some, right? Right, so we have some of you in here. I see a couple of hands. China. Aisha, you did some NRV too, right? Am I correct? Dion. Okay, so we have about 5 to 6 persons. Shamoy. All right. That's useful. And in the chat, oh, okay. Let me just go on to one more. So I'm gonna ask Anna to remind me again about the photo. So net income factor, then we're gonna go on to production function, which I sort of mentioned this morning as well. It's really looking at the value of a non-marketed ecosystem product or service by assessing its contribution into something else. And I think one of the best services that I use here is the service of pollination. This is a good example of how you estimate the value of a non-marketed ecosystem product or service by assessing the contribution into a production process of something that is commercially marketed. Anybody wants to think about what applications we can use production function for? And why does it differ from net income factor? How would it differ? Well, it's there in a way. Inputs and outputs. Any other than pollination, what are some other things that we can use this production function for? What ecosystem services could contribute to a production process of a commercial nature, of a commercially marketed good, other than in agriculture? So we have pollination. Is there anything else?
I'm gonna
We
try.
had a long discussion last week on it. Christina?
Oh, I don't know, but I'm gonna try and say maybe aesthetics for like a tourism commercial product. I'm not sure.
What would be the contribution of the non-marketed services into the production process of a commercially marketed good? So share with us from that perspective. What is the input into the production process?
Well, I was thinking like the non-marketed aspect would be the quality or the view of, I don't know how to put it into words, like, but it contributes towards you generating money from it in a tourism nature, like how it makes you feel, the view, the ambience. Would that be?
What is so the non-marketed ecosystem service, what exactly is it? The view, the aesthetic view?
Yeah, the aesthetic view.
And it's into the production process of a commercially marketed good is the tourism product.
Yes.
So then what we're saying is that the value of our beaches in Jamaica is equivalent to, as an input into tourism, it could be equivalent to almost the value or the portion of the tourism product that is sold for persons who go to the beach, or persons who, okay, so you have a small amount of tourists who come to Jamaica, but they are not coming to a beach, right? Agreed? Small amount. So you're saying the beauty of the country is an input, or the beauty of the beach is an input into
the tourism product.
The tourism product.
Yes.
And therefore the value of that beauty, that beach, is a proxy to the value of the product.
Yes.
Okay, we can go with that. Are there any others? I thought of one. We spoke about one a lot last week, not within this particular way, but we sort of spoke about it somewhat. there was a lot of discussion around this particular ecosystem service when we were doing EBAs, a long discussion.
You mean food security?
No, no. Anybody from NWC here today? No? I know one person wasn't supposed to be here, but anybody? Okay. What about the ecosystem service provided by your watershed management units and the contribution to production of water? Would that work as well? What would be the input in the production process? What would be the input from the ecosystem?
The water.
The water.
So that would be the output.
Rainfall would be the input.
Oh, okay.
But what else would be an input here? Rainfall can be an input, will be an input, obviously. But what else is an input? The roots of the trees, right? And the trees themselves.
The trees.
Because what was one of the
Wow.
things we mentioned last week? That when it, and it's something that people talk about all the time. It's very ironic that when we have rain, their systems are locked off, right?
Right.
Because they can't deal with the mud, the sludge, the stone,
Turbidity.
the turbidity. Exactly. They can't deal with it. Their systems can't manage it. It damages the water production systems, right? So you have to, so directly but they are producing, they're getting water, right? What they want at the end of the day is clean, clear water,
Clean.
right? But they're not getting that because of the state of several watersheds, right? So your watershed and the services it provides is a direct input into the production of both the quantity and quality of water that NWC receives, right? And
To an extent, because most of
they
Jamaica
get-
is underground.
Huh?
To an extent, because Jamaica receives most of its public supply from wells.
Right. Yes, we
Most of it, okay.
And where is that water coming from?
Well,
Underground.
Yeah, where is it coming from? It's not like oil, right?
It's not like oil.
What I mean by it's not something that it's not like oil that's in the ground and you just, where does that water come from to get into the well?
It comes from well, the direct input
Aquifers.
is rainfall into the
Comes from
aquifer.
rainfall.
rain.
Yeah, but
Rainfall
what gets it into
recharges the
aquifer?
groundwater.
What gets it there?
What gets into the aquifer?
Yeah, how does it get
The
there?
river.
Infiltrate, it goes through the soil.
Okay, so when you do not have a properly functioning watershed, what also happens there?
You would have
The
less
aquifers get
infiltration.
contaminated.
Water supply is compromised,
Why?
whether from
Because
pollutants or
more
from lack of
water-
water.
All right.
More water runs off the land, right?
Right.
Yeah, like all right, for where watershed is concerned, like for
Yeah, I understand all of that, so I'm trying to get to.
no,
Yes,
I just adding to your point where the watershed acts as a what is it now, a settling area that the water will stay for a while and then it infiltrates into the soil. So
and
it's
it
very
infiltrates and it go where it's supposed to go and the water is clean, clear, and it gets, a lot of it will get into your groundwater supplies, it go da, 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 da. But if you don't have that, what happens?
you would have
You have flooding,
you'd have a lower quality of water.
lower quality of water, less water getting into your groundwater, because what's happening? It's just flowing off the land, right?
Yep.
Surface
More
water runoff.
You have a lot of surface water runoff. Some of that surface water runoff impact. So overall, what we're saying is that if we do not have that watershed, it impacts the production of water.
Yes, it does.
Right? So a change in watershed management, if we were to say to NEPA, when you're doing your revised watershed management study, watershed management, what is it again? It's not a study. It's they're looking at, and anybody from NEPA can help me here. You're reclassifying the watersheds, right? And in that reclassification process, you would know which ones are degraded, which ones are severely degraded, and so on. Understanding the value of the watershed through the value of the watershed to the production of water, to the state of the wells. So, I mean, it gives you a good indicator of why there ought to be greater investments in watershed management. Understand?
I agree.
Because the contribution to the input, the contribution of the watershed to the input is great. So if, for example, we had intact forests, better watersheds, the cost of producing water would be less. And who is impacted by the cost of water? The consumer, right?
Yes.
And why are we impacted? Because of treatment costs and other costs. In terms of wells, are we impacted as well? And how, for example, with a changing climate, increasing demand for water, would our wells be affected? If we are abstracting more water than water gets into our wells, we will have what? Saltwater intrusion in those wells, right? And over time, with increasing saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, etc., certain wells have to be abandoned. Correct?
Or we can have what happened in Mexico City, whereby the city actually sinks.
Sinks?
Yes, ma'am.
What does that mean?
Because they overpumped their aquifer in Mexico City. They created a phenomenon called geological subsidence, whereby something had to fill the space. Because no water wasn't there, the city just sank and fill the space of the empty water pockets. So Mexico City is actually sinking.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Right. So you understand how then you could determine the value of an ecosystem based on its contribution to things that we can utilize on a day-to-day basis. So for example, if we think of cockpit country, can we make a case for the value of cockpit country based on its production of water over time? So one of the things that we do know, I think, is that for water production, most of the tourist ships that come to Jamaica, it's not just because of the beauty of Jamaica it comes. And the time that it comes to Jamaica is also very strategic. The point at which it stops in Jamaica, because it actually collects water here, right? It purchases water from Jamaica. So instead of dumping waste in Jamaica, it keeps its waste and it purchases water because of the quality of our water, right? So can you imagine if we cannot have that quantity and quality of water over time coming from cockpit country? I would imagine for that side of the country. And so you begin to see the rationale for conserving some ecosystems when you look at the value of those ecosystems to other things in society. All right. And you will be surprised. I did a training. It wasn't really a training, it was a sensitization at cabinet many years ago of a cabinet. And somebody thought that water fell into the Mona Dam. A minister at the time. So it filled up because rain fell.
Wow.
Not because you had all of these processes and the watersheds and whatever. And plenty of people do think that as well, by the way.
And a lot of people doesn't know that the water that you drink in Kingston is not from Kingston.
No, it's from St. Thomas, right?
St. Thomas and St. Catherine.
And also, it also prevents persons from St. Thomas from having access to water because the water is diverted to the capital city.
And
So
that's-
true.
it is causing a little problem now, but don't worry, guys. Plans are in place for St. Thomas people.
Or you're from
Looking forward to it.